Presenter is Research Associate in the Agricultural Economics, Sociology, and Education Department at Penn State University. Dr. Eaton's work examines renewable energy technology development from the perspective of people living in communities where bioenergy facilities are proposed for development. A key part of this research explores how communities construct cultural resources around previous and ongoing extractive and industrial development and draw on these resources when making sense of and responding to new technological projects. His work has also focused on improving engagement between universities and the public around emergent, complex, and contested science and technologies. Now, his primary research focuses on efforts to expand the emerging bioeconomy in the Northeast United States, work whose results he'll be sharing with us in today's webinar. Wes has been interviewing and surveying Northeastern landowners, as well as scientists and other promoters of bioenergy development. Areas. 1. Understanding the range of different ways bioenergy development is envisioned across the region. 2. Examining how experts conceptualize lay people such as landowners, and how these conceptualizations shape engagement between the university and citizens, and for bioenergy and willingness to plant bioenergy crops on their private land. So Wes, thank you so much for joining us today to share your results and experiences.
Well, thank you for that nice introduction, and I will ask folks to also let me know if my voice is clear. And to add a little bit to what Sarah just said, or actually kind of to simplify it, what I'm interested in doing and what I'm going to talk about briefly today with this survey is expanding our understanding of what drives or motivates landowner participation with bioenergy to include questions of economic or productive inspiration, to also include this broad group of things that I call socio-cultural factors. So earlier this spring, we had conducted this survey of landowners, and I'm going to present and walk through how the survey unfolded, and then at the end of my discussion, we'll talk about what some of the takeaways might be in terms of crops. So the basic question here as we think about the Northeast is landowners and perennial grasses. And the idea is that in the Northeast there is a lot of land that could be used potentially for bioenergy production. And particularly this place has been targeted for new bios research based on idle land or land not in production, or something folks also refer to as marginal land. And that the key research question, or the key outcome variables we are keeping in mind as we design this survey, is drivers of two things. One, support. And I'm going to talk more specifically about what that means as people who indicate support for bioenergy crops in their community. And then the second outcome variable we're looking for is landowners that would indicate willingness to plant bioenergy crops. So in other words, we have a question of general support, and then more specific, something the bioenergy crops we're talking about specifically, and I'm going to just use the word bioenergy crops for the rest of this presentation. But what I mean by that, and what respondents on this survey were asked specifically about, were three sets of these perennial crops. Willow, fast growing, which can be harvested and sprouts back up from the same stumps. Switchgrass, a perennial grass, as well as miscanthus. And you can start to see the differences that they have on the landscape from these pictures. I'm sure folks, I recognize some names here, are quite familiar with these. But important to keep in mind is how some of these look like existing crops that you might find hay, whereas other of these crops may be unfamiliar to new people, or stand out on the landscape as something new. So let me tell you a little bit about what we actually did in the survey, and then I'm going to go on and talk about some of our general findings with what our survey tells us about the folks that own land and manage land across the Northeast. So this was a survey, and it also had an online option. And this survey targeted landowners in 3 states, each of which had BCAP regions, which is where we specifically targeted landowners. The idea there was perhaps in BCAP regions there'd be more general discussion of this idea of bioenergy crops in general, perhaps in the newspaper or something like that. New York, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. And we targeted landowners that had at least 10 plus acres. Now this second bullet point, stratified sampling, means we took precaution to make sure we were getting adequate responses from across each of the regions within these states. And we mailed these out to 3,000 landowners, and the survey went through to the number you see there, 2794. And ultimately, 907 surveys were completed, and that included 64 responses that we got back online for a response rate of 32.5%, which is a response rate I was pretty excited about to get from this population. Okay, I told you I was going to tell you a little bit about Northeast landowners. I'm spending some time right now actually taking the survey findings and creating a short white paper, so to speak, that's going to give these statistics more in general. But for the purpose, I just wanted to give you a snapshot of folks. Yeah, about 3/4 of respondents indicated they had some forest land. I think that speaks to the parcelization, the properties of the folks that we sent the survey to. These were predominantly older population. So if you break down their age, 90% of respondents were over the age of 45, and about half of the respondents were between the ages of 46 and 65. A quarter of survey respondents indicated that they did have some idle land or agricultural land not in production. A third of these are college graduates. 3/4 of these folks live on their land full time. So we did get 25% respondents that are absentee landowners, but the majority of them do live in the places that we sent the letter to. The vast majority of these folks made over 50K a year. Most of them own or lease what I just put on here is a full range of acres. But to be more specific, of these respondents indicated they had at least 80 acres. And then if you put 75% of the total respondents, 75% of respondents had about 150 acres. So we're talking about relatively small parcels of land. And most indicated that they do grow something. They do something on their land. And the questions we had were for row crops, which were half of respondents indicated they grew row crops, and about half of respondents indicated they did grow forage crops, or there was forage crops being grown on their land. And a much smaller percentage had things like orchards or vineyards. So that gives us kind of a perspective of who these folks are that are responding back to this survey. So the research questions that I'm going to focus on for the rest of this talk are, again, what I'm broadly referring to as socio-cultural drivers of two things: this support and willingness to plant. So the first, there's going to be 3 sets of factors that I'm looking for, how they relate to these outcome variables. The first is land management goals. The second is this idea of sense of place. And the third is something I'm referring to as symbolic interpretation. I mean the people's perceptions they have for questions of technology and nature in general. So let me explain what each of these means and the way they were related to respondents' land management goals. So we included 2 sets of questions about land management goals. The first is amenity goals, and the second are what we call production or profit goals. So we ask questions about preferences for habitat, recreation, hunting, things like this. Aesthetics, simply I manage my land for viewing wildlife or viewing nature. Those kind of questions were included. and then the production profit goals, asking people if they manage their land for the goal of managing a profit. Now you can see I put some references across the bottom. That's just to show that this is drawing from the existing literature on drivers of landowner behavior with bioenergy crops. And these are things that are listed in that literature that we should be looking for. Okay, so before I go on to the second and third research questions for each of these, I wanted to give folks tuned in today a little more clear picture of what the actual questions were on the survey. So if you look at this table and you look up and down on the left-hand column, you can see the actual language we used and asked folks in the survey. And now, if you look done as these questions were a Likert scale. So for instance, we would ask them, do you manage your land to make a profit? And then you could indicate this is not important or slightly important, or you can indicate moderately important or very important. And what we've done is collapse that into two columns here to show this. So one thing that we can look at this table briefly and get a takeaway is the broad variation from respondents across these questions. For instance, half of folks felt managing land for profit was important, where half didn't. And you can look down a little bit and see those numbers get higher. To protect the environment, people indicated that was very, very important, where fewer people indicated less. So I'm going to come back to these as I show how we do our analysis. So the second bank of questions that fall into our second research question is this idea of sense of place. I think most people are familiar with this idea of, here at the bottom, place attachment, which is an emotional bond folks have with their land. I didn't realize it was not going to highlight all the way through. So in general, these sets of questions ask people about their experience of and the symbolic meanings they attribute to a setting around the land. So this first bank of questions was on dependence. How reliant are folks on their land or on the environment? Second is identity. How do they cognitively, how do they mentally connect with their land? And then the third set of questions is this place attachments, idea of an emotional bond people have with their land. And the literature, emotional bond people have, the more place attachment. And if we can increase place attachment, people are more likely to participate in conservation behavior. And that's covered in some of the references I list there at the bottom of this slide. What we wanted to do is test how this sense of place played out, not in a conservation context specifically, but more in this context again of bioenergy crops. Here's some of our just descriptive statistics. Again, the left-handed column, you can get a sense of the specific questions that are listed in the survey. For instance, my land is the best place for me to recreate, or the best place for me to relax. Those sorts of questions. If you go down lower, you can see the bottom question, I feel happiest when working on my land. Also, something striking, if you look to the center and the far right columns, you'll see we don't have quite the variation. What that means is people typically tended to agree with this bank of questions. This tells us something about this particular landowner population that we addressed. And it most definitely speaks to the way we worded these questions in the survey, which I'll talk more about in a little bit. The third set of questions that we want to look at the way they shape support and willingness in our survey, and that I'm going to talk about today, is again interpretations. So three things: technology, nature, and place. In general, this also refers to the meanings people attach to bioenergy technology, specifically nature and community. So generally, how I like to explain what these ideas mean is with a couple pictures. The symbolic interpretations, the power of understanding this becomes quite clear when we think about pictures of forests, or how people experience forests or technologies or land as very different things. So on the bottom left-hand picture, we can see what is actually a bioenergy facility. And here we see something that looks very perhaps clean and perhaps very efficient and maybe innovative. And for somebody else that can look at a picture of a very similar facility, and rather than clean and innovative, we see this steam coming out of here, and it may elicit ideas of coal, or instead of progressive or innovative technologies, we now see risky or perhaps even threatening technologies. So to put this all in context, what we're interested with this kind of questions is how do people's these other things, how do those relate to how people indicate support or willingness to plant bioenergy crops? This table and the table I'm going to show you on the next slide gives us a close peek at the way we ask these questions on the survey. So you can see some of the questions here starting on the left, that they are opposites of each other. The first, bioenergy crop production on the environment are unknown, is the first question. And you can see there's some slightly higher levels of agreement than disagreement with that statement. And then the paired question below it, bioenergy crop production provides a new way to address environmental issues. We also have some high levels of this. Something also to glance at here is the variance between the way people respond to these questions and the columns I've got set up. Now, further on this same topic, these sets of questions, these last four here, there was 10 questions in total. They focus on people's interpretation of their land and what their land is for, or the state that their land is in, rather than bioenergy crop technologies. And you can see the first question is, my land is fragile and in need of protection. And you can see the descriptive statistics responding to that, where the opposite of that is, my land is a resource for making a living. And below this, my land should only be used to provide benefits to myself, versus my land should be used to help solve global environmental problems. And some pretty strong variation across those two. You can see people answered about split across the board. Okay, so what I'm going to do on you've got all these questions on your survey and this range of responses. How are we testing the outcome variables of support and willingness? And what we did was we ran a factor analysis for each of these banks of questions, items that we just went through. So the 8 land management goal questions, they had an underlying theme of either being amenity landowners or production profit landowners. So those questions factored into those two. And what we're going to do is test how one or other of those factors shape the support or willingness in our statistical model. The second, sense of place, we had 7 items. That factored into a recreational sense of place, and that also factored into a livelihood sense of place. And thirdly, the symbolic interpretation, which was the questions we just went over. We get these 2 factors. One we're calling a technology skeptic, and one we're calling a technology progressive. And in other words, their underlying symbolic interpretation kind of factors into one of those 2 themes, which I'm going to talk about quite a bit more for the remainder of this discussion. Now I just want to put up some directionality. This is how we hypothesize these factors would relate to the outcome variables. In other words, we factor would be unwilling or unsupportive of bioenergy crops, whereas folks that reported a production or profit orientation to managing land, these people would be willing to plant, and these people would be supportive of planting going on in their community. And you can see below how we also hypothesize these would relate. Okay, I want to take a minute to talk a little bit more about how we measured our outcome variables. We measure them as dichotomous variables, as either 0 or 1 for unsupportive or supportive. And then on the far right block, we measured willing and not willing to grow as 0 and 1 as well. So in a little bit more detail on the survey, we asked people directly whether they were what degree of support they felt for bioenergy crops happening in their community, and we used those questions for that outcome variable. We did something different with the willingness to grow or plant crops on their land. The survey included several questions about at what price landowners would be willing to plant each of the 3 different bioenergy crops. And what we did, because we're not interested in this this particular project I'm talking about here is willingness for one or the other crop. We brought all those together. In other words, any landowner who responded they would be willing to grow any of the 3 crops at any price, we gave them a 1 was banked as a 0. Okay, I'm going to take some time to walk through our model. Bear with me because I am going to unpack what these things mean in a little bit more clear language, and then I'm going to end by talking about what this might mean for future research, but also what this might mean for engaging with landowners on the topic of a new plant technology or agricultural technologies like bioenergy. So the top 3, I just included a couple of the many variables that we included in the model that we're just holding constant. So we're going to focus on the variables that have some color to them, starting first and foremost with our questions about land management goals and how those shape support and willingness. So the production profit goals, so landowners that indicated or had a high factor score of managing the land for production and for profit, it has no significant relationship with being supportive or being being willing to plant the crops. There was no relationship. We'll talk a little bit more about what that might mean in a little bit. Amenity goals, so those that have reported that they managed their land for wildlife or for environmental benefits or for aesthetics, had no bearing on support as well. However, it did have a negative relationship with willing. So the higher the factor score for having an amenity goal, the less likely the landowner would indicate they'd be willing. So that seems to support the hypothesis we posed. However, I think one of the key utilities of this in a range of similar but yet distinct ways we can get a more complete picture as opposed to writing off amenity goal landowners with just one question. Okay, let's take a look at the 2 factors for sense of place, the livelihood and recreation sense of place. Again, neither of them had any impact on support or willingness. I'm going to talk more about what that might mean in a little bit. But first of all, it shows us that not one way or the other does folks with a certain kind of sense of place, like the reason horses or my 4-wheeler, not only does this not support supportiveness or willingness, it also doesn't seem to get in the way of that for bioenergy crops. Okay, this next set of factors, I put a lot of bells and whistles on there, some green and red to indicate the directionality of the relationship between support and the willingness models. Tech progressive, being someone who factors into tech progressive versus tech skeptic, a very strong relationship with support. The 3 stars mean the findings are statistically significant at the 0.001 level. 2 stars are 0.05, and the 1 star is just a 0.1. So you can see these strong relationships with the higher the factor score for a tech progressive, the more likely to be supportive and willing to plant, and for tech skeptic. Okay, so I'm going to get into what this might mean a little bit now. And at first I just wanted to put up what those questions again are that people agreed with, and when they agree with these, they're so much more likely to be supportive or willing. Bioenergy crops provide a new way to address important environmental issues. Folks that natural processes, and folks that agree with the statement, bioenergy crops would provide benefits to my community. These are the folks that we're calling tech progressives. Tech skeptics, on the other hand, these people strongly agree or are more likely to agree with the questions. The impacts of bioenergy crop production are unknown. In other words, this is a risky, perhaps, rather than an innovative technology. Bioenergy crops are seen as, rather than being in harmony, but perhaps conflicting with natural processes. And then some skepticism over what benefits this might provide to my community. I'm going to put up this slide and the next slide. Both show what we call predicted probability plots. The point here is just to give us another way to visualize some of the numbers we came up with. So if you look at the left-hand side of the screen, this is the factor score for progressive. So as you can see across the bottom axis, as the factor score for progressive gets higher, the probability of support increases quite strongly. And then on the other hand, on the other side, we see as the factor score for skeptic. Again, that's the relationship between indicate their level for the factors that fall into technology skeptics. As that skeptic score increases, the probability of support decreases. Now this next plots here are the same thing, but this is for our question of willingness, or what I'm calling our willingness model. Or for being a tech progressive, the probability of willing to plant goes up drastically. This is a little less clear for the factor score for skeptic. This was only statistically significant at the 0.01. So this relationship isn't quite as clear between being a skeptic and being unwilling. Okay, this is my last table. Thanks for bearing with me as I report all these. So we had the items from the symbolic interpretation questions that factored into being a tech skeptic and a tech progressive. There was also 4 more items that had statistically significant, or at least important, relationships in our model. The first is land is fragile and in need of protection, and the second is land is a resource for producing from. You can see in the support model and the willingness model, land is fragile and in need of protection is statistically significant, with increased likelihood of being supportive or being willing to plant. Not so for land as a resource. That did not have any bearing on either of the outcome variables. I'm going to talk about what through these findings. And then the second set is land should be used to the benefit of my family. Had no impact on support. Either did my land as a resource for providing global benefits. However, both had implications for actually planting the crops, being willing to plant on their land. Land for family benefit had a negative relationship. So the higher the score for land for family benefit, the less likely to be willing to plant. And just the opposite for land is something that should be used for global benefit. That had a positive relationship with being willing to plant. Okay, before I go on to discuss what we think this might be, I want to say a couple things as I have this summary slide up. What this slide does is tries to capture, these are what we felt and hypothesized and drew from the literature to be some of the most important factors that would shape landowner support and willingness. And here is the most clear, concise summary of our findings with the relationship between these factors and the outcomes. So to kind of start to move to the conclusion of what I want to talk about today, analyzing these findings, and some of the things I'm going to raise right now are the questions I'm discussing with my human systems team here as what we think is going on with these findings. And I also think this presents an opportunity for others to indicate some questions or their experiences. I can see there's some very experienced in this field participants on this webinar today, so we definitely look forward to I definitely look forward to hearing what people think of some of these things as well. So the first thing that sticks out to me is that being a production or a profit-oriented landowner had no effect in our model. That seems to be quite different than some findings in some recent literature. For instance, a paper from Michigan State University and elsewhere points out targeting profit-oriented landowners might be the way to go in that context. Here in the Northeast context with perennial grasses, we didn't get those same findings. That doesn't seem to be that's going to be an effective approach, is to find profit-oriented landowners here in the Northeast. What did an amenity-driven landowner, how did that shape support and willingness? We had no relationship in our support model, but it did predict unwilling to plant, which was in line with what our hypothesis might be. Recreational or livelihood sense of place. Again, I had this idea that my land is the best place for me to make a living, or my land is the best place for me to hike or enjoy wildlife. In the context of bioenergy crops specifically, that we've titled this have any bearing on our outcome variables. However, in existing literature on landowner perspectives on implementing conservation behavior or best management practices, it was important there. So that's really interesting to continue to unpack what we think those findings, what that might indicate. It's neither a boon or a bust in terms of relationship to these crops in particular. So, and the strongest findings we had is something I want to unpack what we think this might mean, is symbolic interpretations. They're our strongest drivers. Again, to just review what these means is that this idea of being a tech progressive or indicating tech skepticism, these had the clearest implication. So just to refresh, a tech skeptic were folks who agree with these statements. Bioenergy crops have the impacts of them are unknown. Bioenergy crops may be in conflict with natural processes, little benefit to my community. And then the progressive, these are the folks that agreed with these statements. Bioenergy crops are a new way to address environmental challenges in harmony with natural processes. And just to review the end of this set of symbolic interpretations before I put a few words to what we think this might mean, folks that answered the question, land is fragile and in need of protection, they're more likely to be both willing to plant and supportive. What does this might mean? If you're in need of protection with the tech progressive, you get this idea that perhaps bioenergy crops, for the way and the context in which our respondents were answering our survey, could be symbolically linking. That means interpreting their meaning or making sense of bioenergy crops. This is linked with perhaps a latent environmental ethos that is indeed rooted in tech progressivism, which in most simple forms means kind of this unreflexive faith in technology as providing progress. The last two of the bank of questions we call symbolic interpretations are land as should be used for family benefit, and land ought to be used for global benefits. The first of these, people that indicated land should be used as a family benefit, were clearly less likely to be willing, whereas land for global benefit is more likely to be willing. This goes back to what I said earlier about having to bring these banks of questions into conversation with one another, not drawing or putting too much weight on our finding about the relationship between amenity landowners being unwilling. If you look at these questions together and these responses, of bioenergy crops for our respondents as providing or being its purpose as less of a private benefit, but perhaps more as a public or extra community or an environmental benefit. So folks with the symbolic interpretations of those being something important are the ones that are more likely to be willing to plant and supportive in their community. Okay, let me break down a few simple takeaways here before we have some time for discussion. What does this tell us? So to summarize, we saw that neither profit motive or sense of place for our respondents and the way we worded things in our question had a significant relation for driving these landowners' decisions and attitudes about bioenergy crops. Instead, in simplest terms, what we think we're seeing is this latent environmental views are attached to the possibilities for bioenergy crops, and also perceptions of new crop technologies. Again, as something perhaps innovative or that can answer emergent environmental challenges, or something that might be in conflict with existing natural processes. Those are really the strongest drivers of support and willingness that we found. And I want to say, I think there's an opportunity here to better connect bioenergy crops outside of just a productive or profit-motive crop with a broader set of existing concerns for environmental issues. Something especially comes to mind being here in Pennsylvania. Water quantity, considering the context of Susquehanna watershed and Chesapeake Bay and things like that. I'm going to speak more about this here in this slide. So some previous literature that paid attention to people's symbolic interpretation of technologies, and this was research on wind energy and solar, pointed out that if you miss people's symbolic interpretations of the technologies, you may be overlooking reasons why they agree or disagree with certain developments. Again, we brought that in conversation with our questions. And a takeaway here that I feel really builds on that is that these, for tech progressives and tech skeptics, the way we engage with them might have very different implications. So a typical outreach approach, and by this I mean basically information provision, fact sheets, demonstration tours, providing landowners new information under the assumption that people will have the same meaning for that as the information that's given to them. This may reach this group of people that we're labeling tech progressives, who have these underlying faith in technology or being beneficial for the environment or nature. But this might be a missed opportunity for engagement. That means that when we work with groups of people that may fall under or be persuaded more by one or the other of these worldviews, we need to transform our typical way of doing outreach from information provision to something else. And by this something else, I think we can go to what many folks in this room, this chat room here, are familiar with, which is stakeholder-driven engagement on approaches. So in other words, rather than information provision, the approach would be premised on this idea of collaborating with the publics involved. In this case, this would be the landowners. And this collaboration would take place not just in developing the bioenergy crop on their land or the new bioenergy technology, but all the way from designing and thinking about what that might mean all the way through implementation of bioenergy technologies. Moreover, these findings suggest that once we kind of uncover these symbolic interpretations, we can see that when we have these responses to land is in need of protection, or land can provide, how does this latent environmental framing or value going on. In other words, the way that we frame bioenergy technologies might be important if we talk about them in terms of environmental benefits as opposed to an economic opportunity. What this kind of means in practice is that when which is definitely something that's necessary in order to enroll broad numbers of people, especially in the context of the Northeast where you're talking about small plots of land. Again, as I said earlier, about half of these respondents have 80 or fewer acres, and 75% of these respondents had 150 or fewer acres. If you're going to engage with these folks and enroll plenty of them, we're going to have to understand the implications of a tech skeptic or a tech progressive. And as far as the engagement practice, what the literature is telling me, and speaking with people also through my qualitative interviews, is that the engagement itself might first start by targeting and understanding how landowners themselves frame the problems and the solutions that bioenergy crops are intended to provide. If engagement unfolds with the assumption that these are tech progressives, where we're in agreement about what the problems are and what the solution should be, we're going to miss that group of tech skeptics. Okay, my last couple slides are just going to close this up. I wanted to put the names up of here at Penn State as well as SUNY ESF. And for the record, I wanted to put up a few references that have been important for our thinking about designing the survey and what this survey might be. And I also wanted to put up a few engagement resources that I found to be helpful, especially when we talk about stakeholder engagement. And so the first, for the Penn State Engagement Toolbox, this is something engagement professionals are using to engage with publics around contested topics and issues. The second resource listed here is a project I was privileged to work on with the North Central Regional Center for Rural Development. And rather than targeting engagement contexts where there is already contestation, the point here is how do we engage when the topic is unknown or unfamiliar to most people. So how do we engage in the context of uncertainty? So that concludes my presentation. Maybe I'm going to just take us back up to the summary slide and look forward to hearing some questions that folks might have, or some takeaways they might think they're seeing as well.
Yeah, we've gotten a lot of really good questions in. I'm going to start, not necessarily in the order that the questions were received, but maybe we can talk a little bit about first some of the baseline background factors, and then we'll get more into results. So one of our questions comes from Bill, who asks about whether the respondents that you identified were familiar with bioenergy. They have aspirational goals for a biorefinery interest that might be looking at their neighborhood. So this gets to sort of the baseline information that people came into the survey with. Did you provide information to familiarize them, or did you rely on their own understanding of these three crops that you asked about specifically? And is there any danger of bias in introducing limited education resources in a limited amount of time on these crops before the survey?
Right, that's this was for me a very interesting experience putting this survey together for several reasons that are closely tied with that question. We partnered with, I myself trained as a sociologist. I work with geographer as well on this project. And then we had a resource economist that we put this information together with, put the survey together with, one of which had an extension appointment. And so there was a real debate. Do we include a pamphlet that explains the particulars and the quote-unquote facts, like a fact sheet about each of these crops within the survey itself, or do we not include it? Ultimately, we decided not to include much more information than a few basic sentences about these crops. Our philosophical understanding was we wanted to understand where people were at when they received the survey. We felt like if we included a fact sheet, the survey would actually be measuring, kind of like testing people on whether or not they read the fact sheet or not. So we saw a lot of reliability issues if we were to include that. We wouldn't know, for instance, if the that the survey respondent actually read the fact sheet. So what were we at? We wanted to measure people's existing knowledge rather than measure how well people do, quote unquote, on a test that would be for the fact sheet. And that basically is the tension we had within our group when we designed this. So as far as, and I must say, Sarah, the beginning of your question did cut out, but I think you said something like the participant wanted to understand a little bit more about the context of what's going on. Are these people in places where bioenergy development is actively proposed, or is this something totally out of the radar? It's a little bit something in between. In some of these places, in these counties where we had targeted, and I should first and foremost say we targeted landowners in counties where BCAP has been a program, bioenergy crop program, going on for some years. So we had that going on. But in many of these counties, there were some smaller grass energy initiatives going on, some smaller companies that are more emergent companies that are looking to contract with landowners, for instance, in Ohio and Pennsylvania, whereas in other places, the bioenergy taking place were maybe small grass cooperatives or wood for energy facilities. But no, we did not target respondents in counties that specifically had a big initiative going on that was being made public through the press, more than just what happened to be going on.
Okay, thanks. I think that the reason I was sort of cutting out is when you and I speak at the same time, I think both of our audio tends to falter a little bit. So, and I'll mute myself when Wes begins speaking. So it'll be a slight delay in our interaction, but I think that should improve the audio quality. Hopefully this is a little bit better. Wes, the next question is maybe along the same lines from Joanne. She asks about a particular area and a particular project. She mentions SG Preston doing aggregating for a JetBlue project in Ohio. I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with that project, but perhaps you are. Do you have any insights on how they're interacting with growers? So what, quote, pitches are they making to these growers, and how does that compare with your findings?
There we go. I do not know that specific project, but I have done qualitative interviews across Pennsylvania and Ohio, as well as New York, and have had the chance to interview not just landowners, but some landowners who have experience contracting with some smaller bioenergy projects, as well as with people who work for the bioenergy companies that are contracting with landowners. Very interesting stuff going on in there. We're busily transcribing those interviews right now and developing a paper on the range of views and what's taking place in these communities. But what I can say to that is a lot of what seems companies having to have a very delicate balance of how they sell themselves in the community. Miscanthus, for instance, is quite a disruptive appearing crop on the landscape. It looks unique and draws attention to itself. Miscanthus has some myths, I think that the industry would say, about whether or not it's an invasive crop or not. And there's also the ongoing food versus fuel, quote unquote, debate, all of which many landowners and people who respond to press releases in local papers are sensitive to. So these companies have had to be very deliberate about how they're framing themselves. One of these companies specifically targets land that is not only idle or out of production, but is specifically land where you can visibly see shrubs growing up, and to avoid any local contestation over what land use should be. So I would say the companies that I've interviewed with and met with are very sensitive to, again, people's symbolic interpretations, what these technologies are and what their implications are. So they've contracted and found landowners essentially that are landowners that have a history of leasing farmers to use to grow crops on, but have had a timely willingness to now lease their land for this, for switchgrass or miscanthus, the opportunity arose, and the people were able to make these contracts with those people that didn't have this concern over those trade-offs.
Thanks. I'm going to get to a couple of questions we had that look more closely at results. So the first question is a fairly quick one. What proportion of landowners had support or willingness factors equal to 1?
For question easier to answer, for those that indicated support was 60%, and those that indicated that registered as a 0 were 40%. I don't have the willingness numbers right in front of me. I apologize for that.
Okay, thanks. Another results-driven question that's come in from Kat. She's curious about interaction effects with tech skeptic progressive factors. For example, a tech skeptic and a profit-oriented person may be especially unwilling to grow. So did you look at these interactive effects at all? Were there any interactions included in the model so far, or is that analysis planned for the future?
Kat, thank you for that question. That is a planned analysis. We are very interested in those interactives. This has been a very quickly unfolding project, and while we've tested some of those things out, I don't have banks of tables or results in front of me, and I haven't drafted up a paper yet that would look at that. However, we are very interested in that. As you can see, the rather simplistic way we've done this analysis for clarity kind of just focused on interaction as something that we're having to just think through with our findings. The other analysis, adding to what you suggested, Kat, that we're interested in is variables or items in the survey that predict being a tech skeptic or a tech optimist. So I'm working now with some resource economists here in the department to help me think through how we might do models that predict one of the 2 factor outcomes as well. I also want to say that while this is a work in progress, I'm very interested in staying in touch with folks on these findings, and more than willing to talk about our data that we have here and what we think this might mean, and very much would appreciate people's comments or suggestions in that way as well.
Thanks. I'm going to reorient us to what you talked about at the end, about framing and how we kind of think about these things. You talked about the emphasis on impact on the landscape. Joe brings up a question. He's testing annual biocrops as seasonal cover crops to extract phosphorus, so phytoremediation, from Chesapeake Bay watershed soils. This is something I know that has been discussed within new bio research. Do you have any guesses on annual crops or cover crops compared to perennial systems? My understanding is that this work focused on perennial crops only, but in some of the conversations you've had and in interactions with these landowners, do you have any sense of the way people approach annual crops or cover crops?
The industry's perspective, as far as what the interviews I've been doing for the past year, there's a sensitivity to a project being framed or imagined in terms of using productive land, and that's targeting of idle or marginal land. That becomes a lot more slippery when I'm meeting with and talking with landowners who at least in the interviews I've done, and we've done about 50 across New York and Pennsylvania, less thought marginal or not or productive land is discussed less in static terms and more of in flexible terms, whereas my marginal land may be marginal now because let's say it was a very wet year, but maybe productive land at a different time. Also, farmers on their, or landowners recognize that portions of their field or subparcels, some of that is less productive, or what they might use a language as marginal versus more productive parts of the land. So one takeaway here is that the idea that landowners, at least that I've spoken with, and if you take a look at, and this might get to some of the interactive questions about that we could tease out from this survey, for instance, what landowners are actually doing on their land and what they say about bioenergy crops. I think there's a much less strident use this land for row crops, and I would not consider doing perennials. I think that goes back, especially the way I think this person is wanting to understand this, to the meanings people are constructing for bioenergy crops, and that does tie back to the framing question. Are bioenergy crops a row crop in terms of I grow them because I can earn this much, or how do the other potential values that are associated with those get accounted for, not only in the economic outcome of producing that crop, but the benefits for my land, and whether or not my land should be used for just to provide benefits for my family. But we see respondents responding to the question that my land should be used for global benefits. So while that all sounds kind of complex and mattered, I think one of the takeaways is that there's a lot more flexibility going on for what's happening on row crop.
So Wes, how does legacy planning, land inheritance, these types of factors fit into this whole question about new crop systems? So you mentioned that, I'm asking you to sort of your survey, but certainly that's probably something on the mind of your respondents. You mentioned the majority demographic were older individuals. So this must be something as you weigh these results and consider more effective approaches for extension type engagement. Do you have thoughts on sort of approaching the best types of engagement for engaging on new opportunities with this sort of shadow of legacy planning in mind?
That's quite interesting. I can speak to briefly to a finding on the survey, and I can speak to what respondents in interviews and focus groups are telling me. First off, on the survey, I didn't spend any time today discussing the findings from a question that lists 10 possible discouraging factors, and people's responses to what might discourage them from being supportive or willing. But I can briefly tell you that when we did a factor analysis on those set of discouraging factors, two factors quite strongly emerged. One is market concern, and one which means I'm concerned about the market and its relationship with being supportive or willing. And the second is community concern. In other words, I have concerns that bioenergy crop will not have a positive impact on my community. The first of those, the market concern, had a negative relationship with willingness to plant. The factor score of the respondent for showing concern about there being a market, the less likely the respondent would be willing. Now, on the face of it, that seems kind of counterintuitive, but actually I think what it's just telling us is that the folks that are engaging in discussion or considering bioenergy crops are the ones most informed or most in tune, and they possibly recognize that in the context of what's going on with other energy extraction, that bioenergy crops, perennial grasses, are not the hot investment, so to speak. Now, moving on to the community factor, people that I think and the relationship between the market factor and support and willingness was positive. So in other words, people that had more concern about the market were more likely to plant, more likely to be willing and supportive. Now the opposite for community, people that indicated I'm concerned that bioenergy crops would have no impact, no positive benefits for my community. There was a negative relationship there. So and if we take a step back, that tells us people are thinking about what these crops, because we ask them questions about it, but when they respond to questions about what this might do with their community, they really don't have a whole lot to go on. Perhaps pushing them into spaces they're unfamiliar with, or not aligning with how they're imagining progress in their community. So that's all a little bit vague. But let me link this to some interviews, and I'm going to speak to mostly interviews that have taken place in. It's every time I successfully identify a landowner who's willing to talk to somebody from Penn State about why they own their land and what they do with their land. I get very excited to meet this person and find out kind of what they're like as I'm seeing these different categories of landowners come into my mind. And this can be grossly oversimplified, and I'm going to go ahead and grossly oversimplify and say one of those categories are people who have lived on this land either their whole life or the vast majority of their life. And this falls right in line with the survey findings of between most likely 80 to 150 acres, and some obviously more acres than that as well, but not extraordinary acreages of land. And they lived there their whole life. Their children have and grandchildren are live somewhere else, and they want their kids to have the land, and they also have this land because this land came from their parents or their grandparents or their uncle. So they're both the recipients of this land, and the way they speak to me, it's as if they are the designated caretakers of this land, and they're saddened at the idea that they're not sure what's going to happen with this land in the future. Some talk to me a little bit about legacy planning. 12 or 14 interviewees in particular. They're aging, so they fall right into line with our survey group. They're retired, but they're still active. And they, like I said, they have concern over their children not using it. But importantly, they don't feel completely empowered to, let's say, sell the land or make drastic decisions on that land, because they feel they might be cheating their children if their children do retire to take the land, or they also feel that they may not be entitled to make those decisions because they were gifted with this land or they inherited the land themselves. And the idea of selling the land for what on paper would be tens of thousands, if not much more than that, of dollars, they don't necessarily feel entitled. So there's kind of this freeze moment that's going on, at least in my analysis so far with that particular kind of landowners. Briefly, there's other landowners, people who have owned their land for perhaps less than 5 years or less than 10 years, and they're doing a whole range of things on the land, and that they were interested in bioenergy crops. And why they agreed to my survey is because it was something new and it was something else that might be innovative, or it's another possibility. So these folks are doing things like cheese making or breeding heritage breeds of cattle, or they're growing different crops for produce, so something other than row crops. So I won't ramble on anymore, but I think that those two groups of landowners kind of paint a little bit of picture about what opportunities there might be for engaging with these kind of folks about perennial grass.
Thanks for those thoughts. It'll be particularly interesting then as you start to look at some of these interactive effects to see, whether people who live on their land or absentee landowners have more or less support or willingness. That's going to be sort of an interesting dynamic that plays out as you look at the overall trends of demographics and land ownership as we consider legacy planning. So we're past 2 o'clock now. We do have time. If anyone really has a burning question, I'd encourage you to type it into the chat pod right now. While you're thinking about that, I just want to thank Wes again for joining us. This was a really interesting look. We could probably talk about this I mean, I have a list of many other questions I wish I had time to ask you. But I guess, Wes, in the meantime, if there aren't any other questions from the audience, do you have any sort of last minute thoughts or a key takeaway that you want us to bring away from today's presentation?
Well, thanks for asking that. Yes, I'm very interested in this underlying worldviews on technology and land, not only for scholarly or conceptual reasons, what I call public sociology. I'm very interested in engagement between universities or academic centers and rural people and landowners, particularly in this context of extraction and energy development. And I think that this work has some important findings for how we think about approaching and working with and partnering with landowners in the context of the Northeast, yes, but also beyond. And starting with engagement exercises or activities that bring to bear or bring to the fore the people's worldviews and nature, what nature is for, or in this project's terms, what land is for, and how those meanings are place or locality specific. I would like to continue to think about that and myself work with engagement professionals, extension, and practitioners to make sure this work isn't just something that is in a scientific journal article, but is something that we can work on together to better engage with landowners for all the conservation and water quality and energy benefits that there might be for emerging technologies like bioenergy.
A great point. Important for all research and all industries to consider. We have a few requests for Wes's contact information. Wes, if you wouldn't mind just typing that into the chat pod for our attendees today. We will also be making a recording of this webinar available via the New Bio website, and I will make sure that Wes's contact info is attached perhaps in the description or comment section of that recording, which will appear on YouTube as soon as it's processed. Should be later today or tomorrow. I want to thank you all again for joining us, and I hope you join us next time. We have these presentations monthly that focus on different aspects of our research. Thank you all so much.
Everybody, I appreciate your time. Hope to get some feedback.